The stagecoach groaned to a stop, its leather suspensions sighing like a tired man. When the door swung open, it did not let in a breath of fresh air. It let in the full force of a Colorado summer in the year 1885. A dry, baking heat rolled into the coach, thick with the taste of rock and pine and something metallic, the very scent of the mountains giving up their ghosts to the sun. May Hollis paused on the top step, her hand steady on the doorframe. She was 38 years old, a woman who had learned to plant her feet before she moved. The sun was a white hammer in a pale sky, and the wind that swept down Main Street was not a cooling breeze but a current from an open furnace. It whipped fine, glittering dust into the air, a dust that settled on everything, coating the raw timber of the buildings and the sweat on a man's brow with a uniform. Silvery sheen. Silver Bluff. The name was honest, if nothing else. She descended, her worn leather boots sinking slightly into the thick dust of the street. She watched the silvery powder creep over the toe caps, a welcome mat of sorts. Everyone in this town, she reckoned, wore the same decoration. The rich man in his polished boots and the prospector in his scuffed mules. They were all branded by the same earth. She carried a small valise in one hand. With the other, she accepted the heavy wooden trunk the driver lowered from the roof. It was not a lady's traveling case, it was solid, reinforced with iron straps, heavy with the full weight of her purpose. It held linens, a few books, her sewing kit, and beneath them all, wrapped in oilcloth, a load claim signed and filed by her younger brother, Thomas, 6 months before a support beam had given way in the Black Mesa No. 2 shaft. The town itself was a collection of sharp angles and false fronts, clinging to the mountainside as if it feared a strong gust might send it tumbling into the canyon below. It was a place built of necessity and haste, not for comfort. At one end of the street, the imposing brick edifice of the Black Mesa Mining and Milling Company stood 3 stories tall, its windows clean and reflecting the harsh sunlight with an air of detached superiority. At the other, the Mercury Saloon spilled noise and the smell of stale beer onto the boardwalk. In between, a dozen other businesses catered to the needs of men who tore wealth from the ground: a general store, an assayer's office, a land registry, and a sheriff's office with a man leaning in the doorway, his thumbs hooked in his belt. That must be Sheriff Tate Hollinger. May noted his easy posture, the slight paunch that spoke of a comfortable arrangement. He nodded in her direction, a lazy, dismissive gesture that was not a welcome but an acknowledgement, like a rancher noting a new head of cattle. May did not nod back. She simply met his gaze until he looked away, his attention drawn to a wagon piled high with timber. She had not come here seeking friends in high places. She had come seeking what was right. Her eyes scanned the street, taking in the small details. A large barrel of water stood outside the general store, a tin dipper chained to its side. A hand-painted sign read, 5 cents a cup. Water here was not a right, it was a commodity. A woman's worth could be measured in the inches of whiskey in a bottle, a man's in the weight of ore in his sack, and a person's kindness, perhaps, in a freely offered drink of water. There was little of that on display. She arranged for her trunk to be taken to the boarding house run by a stern-looking woman named Gable. Securing a small room at the back that overlooked an alley, it was spare, containing only a bed, a washstand, and a single chair. But the window opened, and that was enough. She stood there for a long time, watching the life of Silver Bluff unfold. She saw men with the stoop of the tunnels in their shoulders, their face pale beneath the grime. She saw the comings and goings from the Black Mesa office, men in clean shirts and city hats who never seemed to touch the dusty ground themselves. One man in particular stood out. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the very boardwalk he stood upon. Coyle Mercer, the company clerk, the man whose name was on all the official correspondence. He was the polite face of the town's real power. Miles away, where the main fork of the river gave way to a parched tributary called Dry Needle Creek, Boone Lark felt the sun on the back of his neck. At 42, his face was a map of sun and wind, his hands calloused but surprisingly deft. He knelt by the water, the creek so low it was little more than a trickle snaking between sun-bleached stones, with a rhythmic, practiced motion. He swirled the slurry of gravel and sand in his pan. Water was life, and this creek was dying of thirst. He was a man who preferred the company of rocks and water to that of people. The town called him Prospector Lark, a name he neither encouraged nor corrected. It was what he did. He looked for color, for the heavy, telltale glitter of gold that settled in the bottom of his pan. He was not a hard rock man, not one to go deep into the earth. He preferred to read the story the water told, to sift through what the mountains had already given up. His cabin, a small, sturdy structure he had built himself from fallen pine, sat 100 yards back from the creek. It was his fortress against the noise and greed of the world down below. The water receded, leaving behind a fan of dark sand. Boone tilted the pan, his eyes sharp. There, a single, tiny flake of gold, no bigger than a pinhead. It was not a strike, not the kind of find that would change a man's life. It was a day's wages, enough for coffee and flour and maybe a little tobacco. It was honest. He carefully worked the flake into a small glass vial half filled with water. He had learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing to carry in large quantities. It was better to collect it one small flake at a time. Back in Silver Bluff, the afternoon heat gave way to a cooler evening. May took a walk, her purpose to listen, not to speak. The heart of the town, she knew, would be the Mercury Saloon. She pushed open the bat-wing doors and stepped into a haze of smoke and loud talk. The smell was of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and something else, a current of desperation that ran just beneath the surface of the boisterous laughter. She ignored the stares and took a small table in the corner, ordering a sarsaparilla from a barmaid with weary eyes. From her vantage point, she let the conversations wash over her. Men grumbled about assay reports, about the price of blasting powder, about the way the Black Mesa Company seemed to own every piece of the mountain that was worth a damn. And then she heard it, a name, Hollis. Two miners, their voices low and gravelly, were talking at the bar. One said, "I hear tell the company already filed on that Hollis claim up on Dry Needle, the one where the boy got himself killed." The other man spat a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. "That is what I heard. Mercer had the paperwork pushed through slick as you please," said the sister, some old maid from back east. "Signed it over." "That ain't right," the first man said, though he took a deep drink of his beer, as if to wash the words away. That claim was on a good vein. Young Hollis was a worker. The second man shrugged. "The law is whatever Coyle Mercer says it is. Besides, who's to argue old Jacob? The registrar who stamped the original claim he lit out for Denver a month back. Never even collected his last pay, just gone." May's hands grew cold, though the room was stifling. She kept her face impassive, her gaze fixed on the murky contents of her glass. So it was as she had feared. They had not just stolen her brother's land, they had stolen her name to do it. The rumor was a seed, planted in the dark soil of a corrupt town, and it had already taken root. She finished her drink, placed the coins on the table, and walked out, her back straight. The wind had picked up, and it felt cold now, carrying the first chill of the high country night. She looked up at the immense, star-filled sky. The mountains were black silhouettes against the deepening indigo. They were vast and indifferent, holding their secrets and their silver in a stony silence. She had come here thinking she was in a dispute over a piece of paper, a matter of legal correction. She saw now that she was in a fight against a ghost signature, a missing registrar, and a company that believed it could buy and sell not just the land, but the law itself. She walked back to the boarding house, the silver dust on her boots seeming to mock her with its worthless glitter. She unlocked her room and went to the heavy wooden trunk. It was a burden, a tangible link to a brother she had lost, but it was also an anchor. She was May Hollis. She had been a teacher, a wife, a widow, and a seamstress. She had buried a husband and a brother. She was not a woman who would be erased by a forged signature and a convenient rumor. She had not come to Silver Bluff to find shelter. She had come to find justice, and she would not leave until she held it in her hand, solid and heavy as a bar of pure silver. The morning sun did little to warm the air. It only made the shadows sharper. May walked to the county office with a firm stride, the oilcloth packet containing her brother's papers held securely in her hand. The building was little more than a shack, but the words County Registrar painted on the window gave it an authority that its flimsy walls did not possess. Inside, a thin man with a perpetually worried expression sat behind a tall desk. His name was Peters, and his job was to record the endless transactions of hope and failure that defined Silver Bluff. May laid her documents on the worn wood. She explained her purpose clearly and concisely, her voice the calm, steady tone of a teacher addressing a classroom. Mr. Peters licked his thumb and began to leaf through the large, leather-bound ledger, the pages whispering as he turned them. He ran his finger down a column, then stopped. He read the entry, then read it again. A faint sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. He looked up at May, his eyes shifting nervously toward the door. "Well, ma'am," he began, his voice a reedy whisper, "there seems to be a slight irregularity." "What kind of irregularity?" May asked, her own voice remaining perfectly level, though she felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. He turned the heavy book around for her to see. "According to this entry," he said, pointing a trembling finger, "claim number 417, located on the east fork of Dry Needle Creek, was transferred. It was sold to the Black Mesa Mining and Milling Company. The transfer was recorded last month." May stared at the page. The copperplate script was precise, the ink a bold, declarative black. And there, at the bottom of the entry, was the signature that was meant to seal her fate, May Hollis. It was a passable imitation of her hand, but it was not hers. The loops were too flamboyant, the finals too sharp. It was a dead thing on the page, a lie written in a stranger's hand. "That is a forgery," she said, her voice quiet but hard as granite. "I was in Kansas City last month. I have never signed any such document." Mr. Peters began to stammer, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I cannot say, ma'am. I only record what is filed. The paperwork was in order, stamped and witnessed." The small bell above the door chimed, and a shadow fell across the room. Coyle Mercer stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and authority. He smiled, a polite arrangement of his features that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Is there a problem here, Peters?" he asked, his voice smooth as polished stone. "This lady, Mr. Mercer, she is claiming—" Peters trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the ledger. Mercer's gaze fell upon May. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of recognition. "Ah, Miss Hollis, we were expecting you." He walked to the desk and glanced at the open book, though it was clear he already knew exactly what it said. "It seems you have arrived a step too late." "I have arrived to claim what is rightfully mine," May said, refusing to be intimidated. "That signature is not mine. The transfer is fraudulent." Mercer sighed, a theatrical display of patience. "A serious accusation," he said, "and one you would find very difficult to prove. The witness was Jacob Miller, the registrar at the time, a respectable man. Unfortunately, he has since moved on to pursue other opportunities. Without him, it is simply your word against a legally recorded document." He straightened his waistcoat. "The Black Mesa Company has already begun preliminary work on the claim. We operate strictly within the bounds of the law. Miss Hollis, I am sorry you made the long journey for nothing." He gave her another of his empty smiles and turned to leave. "The law in this town seems to be a very flexible thing," May said to his back. Mercer paused at the door. "The law, my dear woman, is for those who understand how to use it." He tipped his hat and was gone, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than all the noise of the saloon the night before. May left the office. the sun blinding her for a moment. She felt a profound weariness settle into her bones, the weight of the injustice. She did not want to fight, but a fight had clearly found her. She walked aimlessly down the boardwalk, her mind racing. She needed a place to think, a place where the air was not thick with deceit. Her eyes fell on a small, neat shop with a sign that read, Finch's Mercantile, Coffee and Notions. Inside, the aroma of freshly ground coffee and clean fabric was a welcome balm. A woman of about 30, with intelligent eyes and a capable set of hands, was measuring out a length of calico. She looked up and offered May a small, genuine smile. "Good morning," the woman said. "What can I do for you?" "Just a cup of coffee, please," May replied. "Of course. Have a seat." The woman gestured to a small table near the window. She brought over a steaming mug a few moments later. "You are new in town. I am Amelie Finch." "May Hollis." May took a grateful sip of the hot, strong coffee. "I saw you leave the registrar's office," Amelie said, her voice low. "You had the look of a woman who just met Coyle Mercer." May gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Is it so obvious?" "To anyone who has lived here more than a month. Yeah. Let me guess. He was polite, reasonable, and explained how everything was perfectly legal while he was picking your pocket." "That is a very accurate description," May admitted. Amelie leaned against the counter, her expression serious. "Be careful, May Hollis. Mercer is the company's tongue, but they have fists too. Men like Rafe Dugan. People who cross the Black Mesa Company have a habit of running into bad luck. A misplaced footing in a dark alley, a sudden spooking of their horse, accidents." "I appreciate the warning," May said, "but leaving is not an option." "Then you will need friends." Amelie's smile returned. Warmer this time. "The coffee is on the house." While May found a moment of respite, Boone Lark was at the assayer's office, a squat building that smelled of chemicals and burnt rock. He untied a small leather pouch and emptied a handful of crushed rock and sand onto the counter. The assayer, a man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, poked at the sample with a dispassionate finger. "Not much here. Lark," he said. "Trace amounts. Barely worth the filing fee." Boone just nodded. The earth gives what it gives. He was about to gather his sample when the door opened and May Hollis walked in. Boone recognized her from her arrival the day before. There was a stillness about her, a self-contained strength that was uncommon in a place like Silver Bluff. She approached the counter, not seeing him in the shadowy corner of the room. She was holding a rolled-up map. "I would like a copy of this claim map," she said to the assayer, "and I need to know if you have any of my brother's old samples." "Thomas Hollis." The assayer grunted, recognizing the name. All his things were sent back with him. "We do not keep old samples, but I can make a copy of the map." He unrolled it on the counter. Boone's eyes, accustomed to reading the faintest signs in the landscape, were drawn to the lines and notations. He saw the familiar curve of the creek, the hash marks indicating the steep grade of the canyon walls. Dry Needle Creek. Claim 417. A jolt went through him, a shock of recognition. He knew that piece of land. He had worked a small placer claim downstream from there 2 years ago, following what he called an orphan vein, a thin stringer of gold that had washed down from somewhere higher up. It had played out quickly, but he remembered the place well. He remembered the odd rock formations, the stand of lightning-scarred pines, and he remembered seeing the claim stakes, freshly cut pine, the notches clean, with 2 letters, HH, carved into the top. May paid for the copy, her face a mask of determined composure. As she turned to leave, Boone stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. May looked at him, her eyes guarded. He was a tall man, weathered and lean, his clothes clean but patched. He held his dusty hat in his hands. "That map," he said, nodding toward the roll in her hand. "That claim on Dry Needle. I know that ground." How, she asked, her tone sharp with suspicion. I worked below it for a season. I saw your brother's markers, the corner stakes. He did a proper job of it. May studied his face, looking for any sign of deceit. She saw none. She saw only a quiet earnestness in his steady gray eyes. Later that afternoon, May returned to Amelie's shop. The two women sat at the small table, a piece of sewing resting in May's lap as her hands worked on instinct, mending a tear in one of her brother's old shirts. He was so proud of that claim, May said softly, speaking more to herself than to Amelie. He wrote to me about it, said he had finally found something that was his own. Amelie listened patiently, her presence a quiet comfort. It is not the first time I have had something taken from me, May confessed, her fingers stilling. She looked out the window at the dusty street. I was engaged to be married once, back in Ohio. A good man, a farmer. His parents were very practical people. When they learned I could not have children, they convinced him to break the engagement. They said he needed a wife who could give him sons to work the farm. They told him I was past my prime, too old. She said the words without bitterness, a simple statement of a past hurt. She was not ashamed of it. She was only tired of being measured and weighed and found wanting by the world's cruel arithmetic. Amelie reached across the table and placed a hand on May's arm. Their world is too small for a woman like you, May Hollis. Let them have it. A commotion on the street drew their attention. A large man with a brutal face and fists like ham hocks was striding down the boardwalk. He was flanked by two other men who walked with the same arrogant swagger. Rafe Dugan. He did not look at them, but May felt his presence like a change in the weather, a promise of violence. Sheriff Hollinger stood across the street, watching the trio pass, his face a blank slate. He saw everything and did nothing. May knew then, with absolute certainty, what Amelie had told her was true. Mercer was the voice, Hollinger was the badge, and Dugan was the fist. Together, they were the company. She made her decision. She would not be driven out. She would not be another one of their accidents. She needed proof. Proof of the forgery, and more importantly, proof that her brother's claim was valid from the start. She needed a witness to those original boundary markers. She left Amelie's shop and found Boone Lark near the livery, checking the shoes on his pack mule. He looked up as she approached. Mr. Lark, she said, getting straight to the point, you said you saw my brother's stakes. I did, ma'am, carved H.H., plain as day, on a granite outcrop by the creek and another tied to a big ponderosa. Could you find them again? I reckon so. The land does not move much. Then I am asking you to take me there. I need to see them for myself. Boone considered her for a long moment. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw a fire that would not be so easily extinguished. He saw a woman who, like him, had been discounted by the world. Going up there would be poking the bear, and the bear in this town was the Black Mesa Company. It was a dangerous proposition. But when he looked at her, standing there in the dust with her chin held high, he knew it was the right one. The land will tell the truth, he said finally, his voice low and certain. If you know how to listen. Yes, May said, and I am ready to listen. Be ready at dawn, he said. It is a long walk. He settled his hat on his head, a silent agreement passing between them. The journey was no longer just about a piece of paper. It was about finding a truth that was carved in wood and stone, a truth that no forged signature in a dusty ledger could erase. They left Silver Bluff before the first hint of dawn, moving as quiet as shadows through the deserted streets. The air was thin and cold, carrying the clean scent of pine and the promise of another scorching day. Boone led the way, his pack mule, a patient creature named Agate, trailing behind him with their supplies. May walked with a steady, determined pace, her brother's map tucked safely inside her coat. The town fell away behind them, a cluster of dark shapes that seemed to shrink with every step, and soon they were alone with the immense, silent presence of the mountains. The trail was not a trail at all, but a steep, winding path of Boone's own making. It cut across a landscape of harsh beauty and recent violence, the skeletons of ponderosa pines, blackened and skeletal, reached toward the sky, monuments to a forest fire that had swept through the canyon the previous summer. Their charred bark flaked away under May's touch, leaving soot on her fingertips. Yet, life was persistent. New growth, a vibrant green against the blackened earth, pushed its way up through the ash. The higher they climbed, the scarcer the water became. Dry Needle Creek was a pale ghost of its former self, its voice a mere whisper as it trickled over shelves of gray slate. May watched Boone pause, his head cocked, listening. He pointed to a dark, wet stain on a rock face above them. He explained that was meltwater seeping from ice trapped deep in the rock fissures. It was the only reason the creek still flowed at all. Every drop was a small miracle. As they walked, Boone spoke, his words as spare and practical as the landscape around them. He showed her how to read the terrain, to see the story written in the rocks. He explained that staking a claim was more than just pounding posts into the ground. It was a formal declaration, a grid laid over the chaos of nature. He pointed out a pile of carefully balanced stones, a cairn, he called it, a marker left by some long-gone prospector to show his way. He knelt by the creek and scooped a pan full of gravel, demonstrating the patient, circular motion of washing the dirt, letting the heavier materials settle. He told her to look for the dark, heavy sand that was often a companion to gold and silver. May listened intently, her schoolteacher's mind absorbing every detail. She took out a small notebook and a pencil from her pack and began to make notes, sketching the shape of the pan and writing down Boone's words. She was a quick study. She asked about the difference between a lode claim, like her brother's, for a vein of ore in the rock, and a placer claim, for minerals found in the gravel of a stream bed. Boone answered her questions with a quiet respect for her intelligence. He was not used to anyone taking such a keen interest in the craft of his life. They stopped to rest in the scant shade of a granite outcrop. Boone unpacked some bread and dried apples while May studied the map her brother had drawn. It was a simple thing, but full of his familiar, neat handwriting. She ran her finger over the spot marked Discovery Point. Boone looked over her shoulder. He said, "That outcrop we are leaning on, I believe that is the one." They began to search the area, their eyes scanning the ground, the rocks, the bases of the burnt trees. It was May who saw it first. Tucked into a crevice, almost completely hidden by a tangle of new growth, was a piece of charred wood. It was the top of a stake, sheared off by the fire or a falling rock. Boone carefully worked it free. The wood was scorched and brittle, but the carving was still visible. 2 letters, deeply incised into the pine. H.H. May reached out and touched the letters, her fingers tracing the lines her brother's knife had made. A wave of grief and fierce pride washed over her. It was real. It was his. This small, burnt piece of wood was a tangible piece of his dream, a truth the fire could not erase. She pulled a small, flat object wrapped in cloth from her pack. It was a tintype photograph of Thomas, a serious young man with her same determined eyes, squinting into the sun. She held it next to the stake. The photograph and the carved letters were her evidence. As the afternoon wore on, the sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to haze over. The wind picked up, moaning through the skeletal trees. It came suddenly, a wall of roiling brown dust sweeping up the canyon. Boone grabbed her arm. He shouted over the roar of the wind, "We need to get down to the creek bed, now!" The world dissolved into a blinding, stinging fury. May could not see more than a few feet in front of her. The dust filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She felt a surge of panic, a primal fear of being lost and overwhelmed. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She would have fallen, but Boone's grip was like iron on her arm. He pulled her close, his body shielding her from the worst of the blast. He put his mouth close to her ear. He said, "Close your eyes. Just listen. Can you hear the water?" She strained her ears against the howl of the wind. At first, she heard nothing but the storm. Then, faint but clear, she caught the low murmur of the creek. It was a thread of sound in the chaos. "Follow it," Boone said, his voice a calm anchor. "Keep listening to the water." He led her downward, one slow, careful step at a time, his hand never leaving her arm. They half slid, half climbed down the bank and huddled in the relative shelter of the dry portion of the creek bed, turning their backs to the wind until the worst of the squall passed. It was over as quickly as it began. The wind died down, and the dust began to settle, leaving a thick brown coat on everything. May coughed, spitting out grit. She looked at Boone, his face and hair caked with dust. Her own was no doubt the same. A small, involuntary laugh escaped her. She said, "Your voice is always a little rough, Mr. Lark, but that dust has made it sound like you have been swallowing gravel." A rare, small smile touched the corner of Boone's mouth. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He replied, "The dust in these parts only makes a liar's voice hoarse. Me, well, I just drink a lot of water." The simple, dry humor of it broke the last of the tension. They were two dusty figures in a vast, indifferent landscape, and for a moment, they were not a prospector and a client, but simply two people who had weathered a storm together. As May brushed the dust from her notebook, her sleeve slid up, revealing a pale, jagged scar on her forearm. Boone's eyes fell on it for just a second. He recognized the look of it, the kind of injury made by machinery, not by nature. He said nothing, but a silent understanding passed through him. This woman was no stranger to hard work or to pain. The knowledge settled in him, a quiet and profound form of respect. They continued their survey of the claim, following the line indicated on Thomas's map. It was Boone who spotted the second piece of evidence. On a sheer cliff face, about 20 feet above the creek, was a broad, ugly stain on the rock. It was a rusty, reddish-brown color, like old, dried blood. He pointed. "That is a gossan." May looked at him, her expression questioning. He explained it was what miners called an iron hat. It was a sign. The rock below was full of sulfide minerals. When those minerals were exposed to air and water, they broke down, leaving that rusty stain behind, and where there were sulfides, there was often silver. He believed the vein was still alive, that it ran deep into the mountain. It was not just a hope scrawled on a map. It was a promise written in the rock itself. They made a simple camp as evening approached, choosing a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock. The air grew cold quickly. Boone built a small, smokeless fire, and they shared a simple meal of beans and coffee. The stars emerged, scattered across the black sky like a handful of diamonds on dark velvet. The silence was immense, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the creek. It was the sound of a dislodged stone from high up on the opposite ridge that first put Boone on alert. He sat up, his body instantly tense, his gaze fixed on the darkness. Then came another sound, faint but unmistakable, the jingle of a harness, the soft clop of a horse's hoof on rock, a low, guttural cough. Someone was out there, moving slowly, deliberately, in the dark. Boone reached over and, with one swift motion, smothered the small fire with a handful of sand. Plunging their camp into absolute blackness, he put a finger to his lips, then gestured for May to follow him. He moved with a sureness in the dark that was astonishing, his feet finding purchase as if he could see every stone. He led her away from the overhang and into a shallow, dry wash nearby. They crouched down behind a cluster of boulders, their bodies pressed against the cold stone. From their hiding place, they could see the faint silhouette of a man on horseback moving along the ridge. He was a large, hulking shape, and even at that distance, there was a menace in his posture. Rafe Dugan. He stopped, his horse tossing its head. He was scanning the canyon below, searching. Boone's mind worked quickly. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, flat piece of tin, the lid from a biscuit box. He held it up, angling it carefully. He caught the faint light of the rising moon, sending a small, bright reflection flashing against the rock face far to their left. He did it again, a quick, sharp flicker of light. The rider's head snapped in the direction of the flash. They heard him urge his horse forward, the sound of its hooves moving away from them, toward the false signal. Boone and May remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, until the sounds faded completely into the vast silence of the night. They waited for a long time before moving back to their camp. The fire remained dead. They did not speak. There was no need. The comfortable quiet of their evening had been shattered, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. Their fight was not just with fraudulent papers and corrupt officials in a dusty office. It had followed them up the mountain. It had a name, and it carried a gun. They had escaped this time, but they both knew, as they sat in the cold and the dark, that this was only the beginning. They returned to the dust and deception of Silver Bluff under a pale afternoon sun, the memory of the night's cold fear still clinging to them. The charred steak, wrapped carefully in cloth, was now a dangerous secret. It was proof, but proof was only as good as the witness who could swear to it. May knew who she had to find. His name was Silas Kettering. He had been a surveyor for the county for 20 years, a man whose lines were said to be as true as the North Star. But time and tragedy had eroded him. Now, he was a ghost who haunted the alley behind the Mercury Saloon, his only compass the neck of a whiskey bottle. May found him there, huddled in a sliver of shade, his hands trembling with a relentless tremor. He smelled of sour mash and regret. She approached him not with pity, but with a directness that was its own form of respect. "Mr. Kettering," she said, her voice even, "my name is May Hollis. You surveyed a claim for my brother, Thomas, last year, up on Dry Needle Creek." Silas blinked, his watery blue eyes struggling to focus on her face. A flicker of something, a memory of a past self, crossed his features. "Hollis," he mumbled. "Good boy, a hard worker." He knew his geology. May knelt so she was at his level, ignoring the filth of the alley. "I need you to testify to that. Silas, I need you to tell a judge you were there, that you saw the markers he set." The flicker in his eyes died, replaced by a raw, animal fear. He shook his head, a violent, palsied motion. "Cannot? No." "Why not? It is the truth." He would not meet her gaze. He stared at his own shaking hands. "I got a slate," he whispered. "At the saloon. Rafe Dugan. He lets it run, as long as I keep my mouth shut." "So your testimony is for sale, and Rafe Dugan is the highest bidder," May said, her words sharp, not with anger, but with a deep, aching disappointment. "It ain't like that," he stammered. "A man gets thirsty." May stood up. She had known men like Silas before, men hollowed out by their own thirsts. She reached into her reticule and took out a few coins. "This is for a meal," she said, placing them in his unsteady hand. "Not for whiskey. When you decide that your thirst for the truth is stronger than your thirst for what is in that bottle, you know where to find me." She walked away, leaving him to stare at the coins in his palm, a small down payment on a conscience he had long since pawned. Her next stop was Amelie Finch's shop, a small island of order and decency in the chaotic town. Amelie took one look at May's face, at the dust ground into the fabric of her dress and the weariness in her eyes, and set a pot of coffee to brew. While May recounted the events on the mountain, Amelie worked, her needle flying as she restitched the brim of May's sun hat, which had been torn in the dust storm. When May finished, Amelie handed her the repaired hat. She also produced a large 2-gallon canteen with a sturdy leather strap. "You will take this," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Thirst is the quickest way to lose your senses in this country, and you are going to need all the senses you have." The following day, Boone took May back to the creek, not to the high claim, but to a lower bend where the water ran a little deeper. He brought 2 pans. "It is time you learned to wash your own dirt," he said. He showed her how to scoop the gravel, how to submerge the pan and use a rocking, circular motion to let the lighter sand and rock wash over the lip. It was a skill of patience and touch, of feeling the weight of the pan change as the worthless material was carried away. May's hands, accustomed to the fine work of a needle, learned the new rhythm quickly. They worked in a comfortable silence for nearly an hour. The only sounds, the scrape of the metal pans and the gentle murmur of the water. Then, in the bottom of May's pan, against the dark sand, something glittered. It was not gold. It was a small, thin flake of silver, bright and pure. She let out a small gasp. Boone leaned over, a genuine smile warming his eyes. "There it is," he said. "It is not a fortune, but it is a start. It proves the vein is alive." They found a few more tiny flakes that morning, enough to fill a small vial. It was not enough to make them rich, but it was more valuable than gold. It was evidence. It was the land speaking its truth. But as they worked to uncover one truth, the town was busy creating its own. Whispers followed May whenever she walked down the street. She saw the women of Silver Bluff, the respectable wives of merchants and company men, stop their conversations as she passed. She heard snippets carried on the dry wind. 38, you say well past her time, no husband, no children, nothing to keep her home. And now latching onto that hermit, lark, shameless. I call it. The words were like small, sharp stones. May had faced hardship and grief, but this was a different kind of assault. It was an attack on her very being, on her right to exist outside the narrow confines of what they thought a woman should be. She felt a familiar weariness, but beneath it, a cold anger took root. She would not be diminished by their gossip. She would not be shamed into disappearing. A new fear began to surface, one she was reluctant to name. Her fight for the claim had become intertwined with Boone Lark. She was beginning to rely on his quiet strength, his practical wisdom. She was beginning to feel a sense of partnership she had not felt in a very long time, and it frightened her. To trust someone again, to hope for something beyond the lonely horizon of her life, felt like a terrible risk. She had lost so much already. She was not sure she could survive another loss. Boone, for his part, was fighting his own ghosts. He had been married once, years ago, a woman with bright eyes and a restless heart. He had been a prospector then, too, always searching for the one big strike that would change their lives. But patience was not one of her virtues. When a man with a producing silver mine came through town, she had left with him, leaving Boone with nothing but a half-empty cabin and a profound distrust of hope. He saw something in May Hollis, a resilience and an integrity that called to the best parts of himself, and that, more than anything, scared him. Hope was a claim that was too easy to jump. Armed with the silver flakes and the knowledge of the carved stake, May walked to the county courthouse and filed a formal complaint against the Black Mesa Company, contesting the fraudulent transfer of her property. The news spread through town like a grass fire. 2 days later, Sheriff Hollinger found her outside the general store. He tipped his hat, his face a mask of false concern. "Miss Hollis," he said, his voice low and confidential. "I heard about your filing. I feel it is my duty to advise you. This is a rough town. Things can happen. For your own safety, it might be best if you were to reconsider your position. Perhaps take the stage back east." "Are you threatening me?" Sheriff May asked, her voice dangerously quiet. He smiled, a lazy, wolfish expression. "Just offering some friendly advice, ma'am, to a lady alone and unprotected." She met his gaze without flinching. "I am not unprotected. Sheriff, I have the truth, and I am not leaving." The next day, Boone rode into town to find the flume that diverted water from the creek to his cabin had been smashed to pieces with an axe. The small vegetable garden he kept was already wilting in the sun. Inside the cabin, his few belongings had been tossed about, a crude and violent intrusion. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear. Rafe Dugan's work. Boone did not waste time on anger. He surveyed the damage, his face grim, and immediately set to work. He spent the rest of the day painstakingly repairing the flume for the garden. He rigged a simple but ingenious device, a long piece of canvas angled to catch the small amount of dew that condensed in the cold pre-dawn air, funneling the precious drops to the roots of his plants. It was a slow, patient defiance. He insisted May stay at his cabin that night. The boarding house is too public. He said, "It is better you are out of sight." She agreed, her fear for his safety overriding her own reluctance. The cabin was small, containing only one room, but it was clean and orderly. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the air smelled of pine wood and coffee. It felt safer than anywhere in Silver Bluff. They did not have much for supper, just some corn they roasted in the embers of the fire. They sat in silence for a while, eating the sweet, smoky kernels from the cob. The shared meal, simple as it was, created a fragile intimacy in the small space. "He was a good man, my brother," May said softly, breaking the silence. "He always believed that if you worked hard and were honest, things would work out. He did not understand a world where men like Mercer could just take what they wanted." Boone nodded, staring into the fire. "I grew up on a creek much like this one, back in Missouri. My father taught me how to read the water. He used to say, the water never lies. It always takes the path of least resistance, but it always gets where it is going." They talked for a long time after that, sharing small pieces of their pasts, stories of childhood and lost family. It was not a conversation of grand confessions, but of small, quiet truths. In the warm glow of the firelight, guarded by the immense silence of the mountains, the wall that May had so carefully built around her heart began to feel a little less necessary. And Boone, watching the firelight play on her face, felt a flicker of something he had long thought extinguished. It was a dangerous, fragile thing. That flicker, it felt a lot like hope. The discovery was not a sudden, dramatic strike. It was a quiet revelation, born of patience and observation. Boone had been tracing the reddish-brown gossan stain along the cliff face, his pickaxe tapping against the rock, listening to the sound it made. He was not looking for a tunnel, but for a clue. The sound changed, from a dull thud to a sharper, more resonant ring. He worked for an hour, chipping away the weathered outer rock, until he uncovered a section of the vein itself. It was not bright and glittering. The rock he pulled loose was dark, almost black, with a greasy, metallic luster. It was heavy, far heavier than ordinary stone. He broke a piece open with his hammer. The inside was a dense, crystalline structure of a deep lead gray. He handed a piece to May. She took it, surprised by its weight. "What is it?" she asked. "Argentite," Boone said, his voice low with a controlled excitement. "Silver sulfide, the heart of the vein." They carried several heavy samples back to his cabin, wrapped in canvas. The mood between them had shifted. This was no longer just about defending a piece of land. It was about protecting a tangible, undeniable source of wealth. Back inside the small, secure walls of the cabin, Boone set up a simple test. He placed a small chip of the dark rock in a tin plate and, using an eyedropper, let a single drop of nitric acid fall onto its surface. The reaction was immediate. The acid sizzled and frothed, releasing a sharp, acrid smell. After a moment, Boone added a drop of salt water from a separate vial. A thick, milky white precipitate instantly clouded the liquid. He looked at May, and she saw a look in his eyes she had not seen before. A prospector's fierce, triumphant gleam. "It is rich," he said. "A high-grade pocket. Your brother was not just dreaming. He found it." The knowledge settled between them, heavy and powerful. The stakes of their fight had just been raised immeasurably. May looked from the fizzing rock to the map on the table, and a new hardness settled in her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, clear purpose. She was no longer just the defender of her brother's legacy. She was its architect. "Those wooden stakes will not be enough," she said, her voice firm. "Dugan or his men could pull them up in the middle of the night. We need to set new markers, something they cannot move." Boone nodded. "Stone cairns." "No," she countered. "Better, we can haul a sack of cement up from the general store, mix it with sand and gravel from the creek. We will set the posts in concrete." Boone looked at her, a slow smile of deep admiration spreading across his face. He had been thinking of the old ways, the prospector's way. She was thinking of the future, of permanence. She was thinking not just how to find a claim, but how to hold it. The next afternoon, as they were planning their trip to the general store, a rider approached the cabin. It was not Rafe Dugan. It was Coyle Mercer, dressed in his impeccable suit, looking utterly out of place against the rugged backdrop of the canyon. He dismounted, tying his fine horse to a sapling, and approached them with his customary polite smile. "Miss Hollis Lark," he said with a nod. "I hope I am not intruding." "What do you want?" Mercer Boone asked, his hand resting on the handle of the axe he had been sharpening. Mercer's eyes flicked to the axe and then back to Boone's face, his smile never wavering. "I have come to make a generous offer. Your legal filing, Miss Hollis, while spirited, is ultimately without merit. It will waste a great deal of the court's time and, I might add, a great deal of your own. The Black Mesa Company is prepared to be magnanimous, to compensate you for your travel and your misunderstanding." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a thick envelope. $2,000, he said, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Cash. In exchange, you will withdraw your complaint and sign a new, legally binding transfer of the claim. You could be on the stage back to Kansas City tomorrow, a wealthy woman." The sum hung in the air between them. $2,000. It was a fortune. It was more money than May had ever seen in one place. It was a new life, a safe life, far away from the dust and danger of Silver Bluff. She could open her own dress shop, live in a proper house, and never again have to worry about the price of a meal or the condescending whispers of small-minded people. She looked at Mercer's clean, manicured hands holding the envelope. Then she looked down at her own, the nails broken, the skin stained with rock dust and grime. She thought of her brother, of his earnest, hopeful letters. She thought of the charred stake with his initials carved into the wood. She raised her eyes and met Mercer's gaze. "I will not sell my brother's name," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the unyielding finality of bedrock. Mercer's smile tightened at the edges. "I believe you are making a grave error, Miss Hollis." He turned his gaze to Boone, as if expecting the man to talk some sense into her. "Lark, perhaps you can appreciate the value of such a practical solution." Boone had not moved. He stood just behind May's shoulder, a silent, solid presence. He did not speak a word. He simply looked at Coyle Mercer and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an agreement with Mercer. It was an affirmation of May. "We are one," the nod said. "Your answer is my answer." The last vestige of civility fell from Mercer's face, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. "Very well," he said, his voice like chipping ice. "You have chosen the hard way." He tucked the envelope back into his coat. "I will have the court set a hearing, and you will find that our version of the truth is far more persuasive than yours. Sheriff Hollinger will ensure the proceedings are secure." He turned on his heel, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and unspoken threats in his wake. True to his word, a notice was posted the next day. A hearing was scheduled before the circuit judge in 3 days' time. The speed of it was meant to intimidate them, to give them no time to prepare. "We need Silas," May said to Boone as they stood in Amelie's shop. "His testimony is everything." Amelie, who had been listening with a grim expression, shook her head. "He will never do it. He is too afraid of Dugan and too deep in his cups." May's jaw was set. "I paid for a meal," she said. "Now I will pay for his freedom." She walked out of the shop and straight to the Mercury Saloon. It was midday, and the place was half empty. She strode to the bar. Ignoring the surprised stares of the few patrons, the bartender, a large man with a stained apron, looked her up and down. "I want to pay Silas Kettering's slate," she announced, her voice clear and carrying through the quiet room. "All of it." The bartender grunted and pulled out a small, dog-eared notebook. He did the sums. It was a significant amount, a testament to months of steady, determined drinking. May counted out the money, coin by coin, onto the sticky bar top. "He is paid in full," she said. "He owes you nothing." She found Silas in his usual place in the alley. He looked up as she approached, his eyes full of a familiar, weary dread. "Your debt at the saloon is paid," she told him. "Rafe Dugan has no more hold on you." Silas stared at her, his mouth agape. He seemed unable to process the words. Why, he croaked. "Because I believe the man who drew true lines on my brother's map is still in there somewhere," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I believe that man wants to tell the truth. The hearing is in 3 days. Silas, I am not buying your testimony. I am simply clearing the path so you can give it freely." That night, back at the cabin, the weight of the coming confrontation pressed down on them. Boone was restless, his hands needing a task. He took the small vial of silver flakes they had collected from the creek. He built up the fire, placed the flakes in a small clay crucible, and set it in the hottest part of the embers. May watched as the silver began to glow, then melt, becoming a tiny, shimmering pool of liquid light. Boone took the crucible from the fire with a pair of tongs and, with a steady hand, poured the molten silver onto a flat, cool stone. He tried to shape it with a tool as it cooled, to form it into a circle, but the metal hardened too quickly, and his tools were not fine enough. What was left on the stone was not a ring, but a rough, lumpy, incomplete loop of silver. He picked it up, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "A failure," he said, the words a quiet, bitter judgment on himself. May reached out and took the small piece of metal from him. It was still warm. She closed her fingers around it. "No," she said softly. "It is a promise." She slipped it into the pocket of her dress, a secret, tangible symbol of their flawed but unbreakable pact. The town, spurred on by Mercer's carefully planted whispers, turned against them. The story changed. May was no longer a grieving sister seeking justice. She was an opportunistic spinster from the East, a schemer who had bewitched a simple-minded prospector into helping her steal from the company that fed the whole town. Boone was no longer a quiet man who kept to himself. He was a fool, a failure who could not find his own color and was now letting a woman lead him by the nose. They felt it in the cold stares at the general store, in the way conversations stopped when they entered a room. The women who had whispered about her age now looked at her with open hostility. The men who had once given Boone a respectful nod now sneered and called him Prospector Hollis. They were isolated, surrounded by an invisible wall of suspicion and contempt. The physical danger was real, but this, May realized, was a different kind of violence. A slow poison meant to break their spirit before they ever set foot in the courtroom. The wind came down from the high peaks that night, a restless spirit moaning through the blackened pines. It rattled the single window of Boone's cabin and made the flame in the oil lamp dance, casting long, wavering shadows that turned the small room into a world of its own. Outside was the vast, hostile darkness of the mountains and the malice of men. Inside, there was the low crackle of the fire, the scent of wood smoke, and a fragile, unspoken peace. May sat in the cabin's only chair, her back to the hearth, her head bent over her work. The lamplight softened the lines of concentration on her face and caught the silver threads in her dark hair. She was mending a tear in the sleeve of Boone's work shirt, her needle moving with a swift, economical grace. The fabric was coarse, faded from the sun and worn thin at the elbows, but her stitches were small and perfect. A line of order imposed on a world of wear and tear. It was a simple, domestic act, yet in the charged silence of the cabin, it felt as profound as a prayer. Boone stood at the wash basin, a simple wooden stand he had built himself. He poured water from a bucket into the enamel bowl. It was rainwater, collected from the canvas trough he had rigged along the eaves. He washed his hands, scrubbing away the grime of the day, the rock dust and the faint metallic scent of the silver ore. He watched her for a moment, the quiet focus of her, the way her presence seemed to fill the small space, making it feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of the things they had not yet found the words to say. He dried his hands on a piece of toweling and came to stand by the fire, warming his back against the heat of the stones. He watched her tie off the thread and snip it with a small pair of scissors from her sewing kit. She held the shirt up, inspecting her work in the lamplight. "It will hold," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. "I have no doubt," he replied. She folded the shirt neatly and set it on the small table beside her. Her hands lay still in her lap, and she looked down at them, at the calluses forming on her fingertips from handling the rough stone, the whispers of the town, the cold stares and the cruel judgments had followed her up the mountain. They were in the cabin with her now, ghosts in the flickering shadows. "They say I am too old," she confessed. The words came out in a low, quiet rush, as if they had been waiting just behind her teeth for a long time. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on her own hands. Boone was silent for a long moment. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound. Then a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was not a sound of mockery, but of a deep and knowing warmth. He said, his voice as steady and solid as the rock walls of the canyon, "The rarest gold is what has already been through fire." May looked up at him then, her eyes full of a raw, questioning vulnerability. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "When you find gold-bearing quartz," he explained, his words simple and direct, "it is locked up in the rock. You cannot just pick it out. You have to crush the rock, and then you have to heat it in a furnace. The fire burns away the sulfur and all the other worthless stuff. It is the fire that releases the gold. It is the fire that shows you what is truly precious." A log in the hearth collapsed, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. May watched them disappear into the darkness. She understood his meaning, and the simple, profound truth of it settled over her like a warm blanket. Boone turned to the small pot simmering on the hearth. He poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed one to her. She took a sip. It was weak, little more than brownish water. A small smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile he had seen from her all day. "This is hot water with the scent of hope," she said, a flash of her old, dry wit returning. Boone grunted, a sound that was half apology, half amusement. "My talents lie with rocks, not beans." They drank their coffee in a comfortable silence. The tension that had been coiled inside May for days began to slowly, cautiously, unwind. She had spent so much of her life on guard, defending herself against the judgments of the world, against the pain of loss. But here, in this small cabin, with this quiet man, the walls she had built felt less necessary. When she finished her coffee, she did not move away. Instead, she leaned her head against his side, a small, tentative gesture of trust. He stood perfectly still, a solid, unmovable presence. He did not put his arm around her. He simply accepted the weight of her, the silent offering. He knew what it had cost her. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "I cannot promise you a fortune. May, I cannot promise you a big strike that will make us rich. My first wife, she wanted that. She wanted the gold without the fire." He paused, The memory of that old wound a dull ache in his chest. But I can promise you this. I will stand with you in the storm. I will not run when the wind howls. I am not afraid of the fire. Her eyes closed. It was a promise of something far more valuable than silver or gold. It was a promise of steadfastness, of presence. It was the promise of a home. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. A feeling she had long ago forgotten was possible. The peace was shattered by a sound from outside. It was not the wind. It was the hard, frantic drumming of a horse's hooves, coming up the trail at a dead gallop. Boone was instantly alert, his body tense, his hand moving toward the rifle that leaned against the wall. Before he could reach it, a sudden, bright orange light flared outside the window, painting the cabin walls in a terrifying, dancing glow. There was a whoosh, a hungry roar, and the terrified braying of Boone's mule. Agate. Boone threw open the door. The lean-to that served as a small stable for the mule was engulfed in flames. A hulking figure on horseback was silhouetted against the fire for a single, stark moment. Rafe Dugan. He let out a raw, triumphant yell, wheeled his horse around, and galloped back down the trail, disappearing into the darkness. There was no time for fear, no time for anger. There was only action. Boone grabbed the 2 heavy water buckets from inside the door and raced toward the fire. The flames were spreading with frightening speed, licking at the dry timber of the cabin's main wall. May did not hesitate. Her mind, sharp and practical, went straight to the terrified animal trapped in the burning structure. She seized a heavy wool blanket from Boone's bed, plunged it into the half-full rain barrel by the door, and ran toward the lean-to, her face shielded by the heavy, dripping wool. The heat was intense, a physical blow. The smoke was thick and choking. Agate was wild with terror, pulling at her rope, her eyes rolling. May spoke to her in a low, calm voice, the same voice she had used to soothe frightened children in her classroom. She moved slowly, deliberately, and threw the wet blanket over the mule's head, covering her eyes. The sudden darkness and the cool weight of the wet wool had an immediate calming effect, while Boone threw bucket after bucket of water onto the base of the flames. May worked on the knot of the halter rope with frantic, nimble fingers. The knot came free. She tugged on the rope, pulling the now subdued animal out of the burning lean-to and away to safety, just as a section of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and embers. Together, they fought the fire, a desperate, silent team. They used the rest of the water in the rain barrel. They beat at the flames with wet sacks. They shoveled dirt onto the embers. The fire fought back, hissing and spitting, but slowly, painfully, they gained the upper hand. At last, the raging blaze subsided into a smoldering, smoking ruin. They stood in the aftermath, leaning against each other, gasping for breath, their faces black with soot, their clothes soaked and stinking of smoke. The lean-to was gone. A section of the cabin's outer wall was deeply charred, but the cabin itself was saved. It was then that May saw the water. The buckets, thrown in their haste, had overturned near the table where they had been working. A pool of dirty, ash-filled water covered the floorboards, floating in it, their ink bleeding into blurry, unrecognizable shapes. Were her brother's map and her own precious notebook. The carefully wrapped ore samples were scattered, lying in the muddy water, their evidentiary value now a sodden, questionable mess. All their proof, all their hard-won truth, was ruined. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. It was too much. The fight, the whispers, the constant fear, and now this. They had won the battle with the fire, but it felt as if they had lost the war. Boone saw the direction of her gaze, saw the devastation on her face. He put a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and grounding. She looked at the smoking ruins of the stable, at the blackened wall of the cabin, at the sodden mess on the floor. She took a deep, shuddering breath, pulling the cold, smoky air into her lungs. Then she straightened her shoulders, and when she spoke, Her voice was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a survivor. "We will rebuild it tomorrow," she said. The dawn after the fire was grim and cold. They spent the morning salvaging what they could, their movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. The air was thick with the stench of wet ash and charred pine. They worked in silence, the unspoken understanding between them a stronger bond than any words. But as the sun climbed higher, a new sound began to echo through the canyon. A low, rhythmic thunder that was not of the mountains. Boom! The sound rolled down from the high ridges, a deep, percussive blow that vibrated in May's bones. It was followed by the faint rattle of falling rock. Boom! It came again, closer this time. It was the unmistakable sound of blasting. Boone stopped his work, his head tilted, listening. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Mercer," he said, his voice a low growl. "He is not even waiting for the hearing. He is blasting along the boundary of your claim, trying to create a rock slide, to bury the vein. He wants to walk into that courthouse and say the ground is worthless because he made it worthless." The blasting continued throughout the day, a relentless, arrogant punctuation to their work. Each explosion was a reminder of Mercer's power, of his utter contempt for them and for the law. They felt like ants on a hillside, trying to build their small nest while a giant casually tried to shake them loose. Late in the afternoon, the sky, which had been a harsh, cloudless blue, turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The wind died down, and a strange, oppressive stillness fell over the canyon. The air grew heavy, thick, and hard to breathe. Boone looked up, his eyes narrowed. He had seen skies like this before. "We need to get the mule inside," he said, his voice urgent. What was left of the cabin was not much, but it was better than nothing. The first hailstones were small, just a few icy pellets that clicked against the roof. Then, with a sudden, violent roar, the sky opened up. Hail the size of robin's eggs hammered down, a deafening percussive assault that stripped the new leaves from the aspens and pounded the dusty ground into a muddy pulp. It was a biblical fury, a sudden wild rage from a sky that had been placid moments before. Through the roar of the hail, they heard a deeper sound, a terrible, grinding groan from the mountain above them. The earth itself seemed to be in agony. Boone grabbed May's arm and pulled her away from the window just as a torrent of mud, rock, and shattered timber came pouring down the mountainside, a thick, unstoppable wave of debris. It swept past the cabin, missing them by a dozen yards, and crashed into the valley below with a sound like the end of the world. When the hailstorm finally passed, leaving behind a world that was battered and strangely white, an eerie silence descended. Then, from the direction of the Black Mesa mine, a new sound arose, a frantic, clanging bell, the sound of shouting, the sound of pure, unadulterated panic. Boone was already at the door, pulling on his boots. "That slide," he said, his voice grim. "It did not just come from Mercer's blasting. It came down on the number 3 shaft. That is their auxiliary tunnel." A small crowd was already gathering at the mouth of the tunnel when they arrived. Men stood about helplessly, their faces pale with shock. Coyle Mercer was nowhere in sight. Rafe Dugan was there, shouting orders that no one was following, his usual bluster useless against the silent finality of a mountain of rock. The entrance to the tunnel was completely blocked. A woman ran toward them, her face streaked with tears. "Emily Finch, my cousin. Will," she cried, grabbing May's arm. "He is on the afternoon shift. They are all trapped." Sheriff Hollinger pushed his way through the crowd. His face, usually a mask of lazy indifference, was ashen. "My brother," he said, his voice cracking. "My boy brother, Jimmy, he is in there." Boone's eyes scanned the rockfall, his mind already working. Assessing, planning, he turned to a group of miners. "Get shovels, and every piece of heavy timber you can find. We need to shore up what is left of the entrance. Now." He started toward the rubble, but May put a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Boone?" she said, her voice low. "These men, they are the ones who have tormented us. Hollinger threatened me. Dugan tried to burn us out. They would leave us to die." Boone looked from her face to the wall of rock, to the terrified faces of the men and women waiting for a miracle. He met her gaze, and his own was full of a hard, sad clarity. "We save lives first," he said. "We can argue about who deserves it later." May hesitated for only a second longer. She saw Amelie's desperate face. She saw the raw, human fear in the sheriff's eyes, and she knew Boone was right. This was no longer about claims or courts or money. It was about the men breathing their last in the dark heart of the mountain. She gave a firm nod. "Let us get to work." What followed was a desperate, brutal race against time. Under Boone's quiet, confident direction, the disorganized crowd became a rescue team. They dug with a feverish intensity, their shovels scraping against the rock. Boone, with the instincts of a man who understood the earth, directed them to a spot high up on the slide. "An air hole," he said. "They need air more than anything." While the men dug, May turned her attention to the waiting families. She moved through the crowd, her voice calm and steady. She had them build a fire, put on kettles for coffee and soup. She organized the women to tear sheets for bandages. Her old schoolteacher's skills, the ability to create order out of chaos, to soothe fear with simple, practical tasks, came rushing back to her. She was a beacon of calm in a sea of panic. After 2 hours of frantic digging, they broke through. A rush of foul, stale air puffed out of the small hole. A faint voice called from within. They were alive. Boone took charge of the next phase, working with a small team. He began to clear the main entrance, a dangerous, painstaking process. They used the heavy timbers to build a makeshift support structure, a wooden skeleton to hold back the tons of unstable rock. Every rock they moved threatened to bring down a new slide. Finally, they had cleared a hole large enough for a man to crawl through. Boone went in first, a lantern in his hand. May, carrying a medical kit Amelie had supplied, was right behind him. The scene inside the tunnel was from a nightmare. The air was thick and foul, the darkness absolute save for the single beam of their lantern. The timbers that had once supported the roof were splintered and broken. Men were lying on the ground, some groaning, some unnervingly still. May went to work immediately. She moved from man to man, her touch gentle but firm. She checked for breath, for pulses. She bandaged a deep gash on one man's head. She set another's broken arm with a splint made from a piece of shattered timber. She spoke to each of them, her voice a low, soothing murmur, telling them they were not alone. That help had come. She found Sheriff Hollinger's brother, Jimmy, a boy of no more than 17, his leg pinned beneath a heavy rock. He was conscious, his young face a mask of pain and fear. May gave him a drink of water and stayed with him, holding his hand, telling him about the farm she had grown up on in Ohio, her voice a steady, calming presence in the terrifying dark. Rafe Dugan crawled into the tunnel, his face smudged with dirt for show. He began to strut among the wounded men, clapping them on the shoulder. "See," he boomed. "I told you we would get you out." Boone intercepted him, his own face black with real grime and sweat. He pushed Dugan back against the tunnel wall, his voice a lethal whisper. "Not now. Rafe, we live first." Dugan, for the first time, seemed to shrink, the bully in him withering in the face of true grit. They began the slow, arduous process of evacuating the wounded, as May was helping a man with a broken collarbone. She heard Boone let out a sharp, indrawn breath. He was standing near the back of the collapse, where the blasting had been closest. He was listening, his head pressed against the rock wall. He understood what he was hearing. The blasting pattern was all wrong. The charges had been set too close together, with dangerously short fuses. It was a rushed job, a sloppy job, done by someone who cared only for speed, not for safety, done by someone trying to meet a deadline. He knelt, and his lantern light glinted off something metallic in the rubble. He reached in and carefully pulled it out. It was a small, brass object, a misfired blasting cap, and etched into its side was a tiny series of numbers, a lot number, the kind that could be traced back to a specific shipment, a specific invoice. At that moment, the mountain let out another deep, terrifying groan. The timbers above them began to splinter. "Get them out!" Boone yelled. "The rest is coming down!" Panic erupted. The remaining miners scrambled toward the entrance. Boone was helping Jimmy Hollinger, trying to free his pinned leg. May was near the back of the tunnel, helping a young miner who was coughing up blood. He was barely conscious, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She held him, trying to comfort him, as the life slowly, inexorably, faded from his body. For the first time since she had arrived in Silver Bluff, May Hollis wept, her silent tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. It was a grief that had nothing to do with land or law, a purely human sorrow for a life cut short in the dark. The tunnel was collapsing. Boone finally freed Jimmy's leg and shoved him toward the entrance. "Go get out." He turned to grab May, but a section of the roof gave way. A shower of rock and dirt rained down. A heavy rock struck Boone in the shoulder, and he went down with a sharp cry of pain. May scrambled to his side. His arm was hanging at a bad angle, his face pale with shock. The entrance was about to close. She put her shoulder under his good arm and pulled. He was a heavy man, and she was not strong, but a desperate. Adrenaline-fueled strength surged through her. "Come on, Boone!" she grunted, pulling him, dragging him, one painful inch at a time. "We are getting out of here." They stumbled out into the blessedly fresh air just as the rest of the tunnel collapsed behind them with a deafening, final roar, sealing the tomb of the young man she had held in her arms. May stood there, leaning on Boone, supporting him, covered in soot and blood and tears, holding the small, brass blasting cap clutched tightly in her hand. The mountain was silent now, but it had given her one last, terrible truth. The town meeting hall was not a courtroom. It was a large, plain room built of raw pine, smelling of dust and sweat and the collective anxiety of a community holding its breath. Every bench was packed. Miners with scrubbed clean faces sat shoulder to shoulder with their wives. Shopkeepers stood along the back wall, their arms crossed. In the front rows sat the men who answered to the Black Mesa Company, their faces impassive. It was a town divided, and the fault line ran right down the center aisle. At a long table in the front sat Coyle Mercer, looking as cool and unruffled as if he were at a Sunday social. Beside him was a man May had never seen before, a lawyer from Denver with a silver watch chain draped across his waistcoat and a condescending smirk that never left his face. On the other side of the room, Sheriff Tate Hollinger stood guard, his hand resting on his pistol, though his eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding everyone's gaze, especially that of his younger brother, Jimmy, who sat with the rescued miners, his leg propped up on a stool. And at a small table facing the circuit judge, a weary but resolute man named Fairfield, sat May Hollis and Boone Lark. May was dressed in her simple, dark traveling suit, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Boone sat beside her, a solid, immovable presence, his left arm bound tightly in a sling, a stark reminder of the price of their evidence. The hearing began with a slick, confident presentation from the Denver lawyer. He spoke of contracts, of filings, of the sanctity of the public record. He held up a certified copy of the forged transfer document, his voice dripping with condescension as he referred to May's claim as a frivolous, emotional appeal from a woman who did not understand the complexities of business. When he was finished, Judge Fairfield turned his tired eyes to May. "Miss Hollis, you may present your case." May stood. "I would like to call my first witness," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Silas Kettering." A murmur went through the crowd as Silas made his way to the front. He was not the trembling, whiskey-soaked ghost from the alley. He was clean-shaven. His clothes were patched but neat, and though a fine tremor still shook his hands, his eyes were clear. He had been sober for 3 days, holed up in a back room at Amelie's shop, drinking endless cups of strong, black coffee and eating hot stew. He looked like a man who had been pulled back from the edge of his own grave. He took the oath, his voice raspy but firm. May began her questions, her tone gentle, like a teacher guiding a promising student. "Mr. Kettering, did you, in your capacity as county surveyor, survey claim number 417 on Dry Needle Creek for my brother, Thomas Hollis, in April of last year?" "I did," Silas said. "And can you describe the boundaries of that claim?" Silas's eyes took on a distant, focused look, as if he were seeing the map in his mind. The southeast corner was marked by a granite outcrop, shaped like a sleeping bear. "We set a pine stake there. The north line ran along the cliff face, the one with the big red Gossan stain on it. The northwest corner was marked by another pine stake, set next to a big ponderosa that had been struck by lightning." "And did you witness my brother mark those stakes?" "I did. He carved his initials, and his brother's, into the top of each one. H-E-H, Hollis Hollis. He called it a partnership." Silas looked directly at May, and for the first time, a faint, sad smile touched his lips. "He was a good boy. Your brother. He did things right." The Denver lawyer sneered. "An old man's memory of wooden stakes that have likely since rotted away or burned in last summer's fire. That is your evidence, Miss Hollis." "It is the beginning of it," May said calmly. She turned to Boone. "Mr. Lark, would you present our next exhibit?" Boone rose, his movements stiff from his injury. He walked to the judge's table and unwrapped a heavy piece of canvas. Inside were the dark, heavy chunks of silver sulfide ore. The judge picked up a piece, his eyes widening at its surprising weight. Boone then produced the simple, handwritten assay report from the town assayer, confirming the high concentration of silver. A low buzz of excitement went through the miners in the crowd. They knew what high-grade ore looked like. They knew what it meant. "And now, Your Honor," May said, "I would like to present my final piece of evidence." She walked to the table and placed a small, insignificant-looking object on the polished wood. It was the misfired brass blasting cap. "I found this inside the number 3 shaft, after the collapse." The lawyer from Denver let out a theatrical sigh. "Your Honor, this is becoming absurd. The defense has already stipulated that the tragic collapse at the mine was a result of a natural rock slide, an unfortunate act of God, exacerbated by an unseasonal hailstorm." May looked at the lawyer, and then at the judge, and then her gaze swept across the faces of the miners in the room. "An act of God," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, clear anger that cut through the stuffy air of the hall. "Nature does not etch lot numbers onto blasting caps." She placed a piece of paper next to the cap. It was the invoice Amelie had found, slipped into the back of a ledger at the general store. An invoice for a recent shipment of blasting supplies to the Black Mesa Mining Company, signed for by Rafe Dugan. The lot number on the invoice matched the number on the cap perfectly. The room was utterly silent. The truth of it, the cold, murderous logic, settled over everyone. Mercer had ordered the blast to destroy her claim, and in his haste, he had endangered the lives of his own men and killed one of them. The lawyer's face had gone pale. He began to stammer, but before he could speak, a new sound filled the room. It was the sound of a crutch thumping against the wooden floor. Jimmy Hollinger, his face pale but his eyes burning with a fierce light, had pushed himself to his feet. "It was not a natural slide," he said, his young voice cracking but full of conviction. "They were blasting all day, rushing us, Boone, Lark, and Miss Hollis. They saved us. They came into the dark and they pulled us out." Then another miner stood up, and another. Soon, all the men who had been trapped in the tunnel were on their feet. A silent, damning jury. They looked at Mercer not with the fear of employees, but with the cold fury of men who had been sent to their graves for the sake of a rich man's greed. Sheriff Hollinger stared at his younger brother, at the men standing with him. The lazy arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, gut-wrenching shame. He looked at May, at the woman he had threatened, the woman who had held his brother's hand in the dark. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his head. The Denver lawyer saw that the case was lost, more than lost. It had become a catastrophe. He leaned over and whispered frantically to Mercer. "Your Honor," he said, rising to his feet, "in the interest of community harmony, my client would be willing to offer a generous settlement to Miss Hollis to resolve this matter." May did not even look at him. She addressed the judge. "I am not interested in a settlement, Your Honor. I am interested in justice. I am asking for 3 things. First, that the fraudulent transfer be voided and that claim number 417 be restored to me and to the estate of my brother, Thomas Hollis. Second, that the Black Mesa Company be fined for reckless endangerment. And third," she paused, her gaze once again sweeping over the miners and their families, "that all proceeds from that fine be used to establish a permanent fund for the safety and welfare of the miners of this town, so that no man ever again has to die in the dark for the sake of a deadline." Judge Fairfield looked at the evidence on his table, the oar, the blasting cap, the invoice. He looked at the silent, standing miners. He looked at the bowed head of the sheriff. He looked at the pale, sweating face of Coyle Mercer. He brought his gavel down with a sharp, decisive crack. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, May Hollis," he declared, his voice booming in the silent hall. "The claim is restored. A full criminal investigation into the blasting practices at the Black Mesa mine is hereby ordered. Sheriff Hollinger, you are suspended from your duties, pending the outcome of that investigation." A collective sigh, then a rising murmur of approval, swept through the hall. Coyle Mercer sat frozen, his mask of civility finally shattered, revealing the snarling face of a cornered rat. But it was not over. Rafe Dugan, who had been standing near the back, saw his world, his power, his entire reason for being, crumble into dust, with a roar of pure, animal rage. He lunged forward, his fists clenched, aiming for Boone. Boone, who had risen to his feet, did not even flinch. He simply turned and looked at Dugan, his eyes cold and hard. He did not need to raise his one good arm. Before Dugan could take a second step, a wall of men moved to intercept him. Miners, the men he had bullied and threatened for years. They did not touch him. They simply formed a silent, immovable circle around him, their faces hard as the rock they worked. Dugan stopped, his rage turning to confusion, then to fear. He was alone. The community had delivered its own punch, a blow far more powerful than any fist. May looked down at the floor. The ever-present silver dust coated the rough pine boards, glittering in the shafts of light coming through the tall windows. But it looked different now. It was not the dust of lies and concealment. It was the dust of a truth that had been unearthed, brought into the light for all to see. A new kind of quiet settled over Silver Bluff in the days that followed the hearing. It was not the tense, watchful quiet of before, but a stillness of exhaustion and contemplation, as if the whole town were taking a long, slow breath after a fever had broken. Coyle Mercer had vanished. He did not pack or say his farewells. He simply dissolved into the night like a bad dream, leaving behind an office full of orderly papers and a town full of his wreckage. Rafe Dugan followed soon after, slinking away on a lame horse before the sun was fully up, his power broken not by a fist, but by the collective, silent judgment of the men he had once terrorized. The most surprising event occurred 2 days later, in the dusty space in front of the meeting hall. Tate Hollinger, his face etched with a shame that was more profound than any court sentence, stood before a gathering of the townspeople. He did not make excuses. He spoke of his brother, of the debt he owed to May and Boone. and of the way he had allowed his badge to be tarnished by the company's coin. It was not a speech of eloquent apologies, but the raw, halting confession of a man who had lost his way and was trying, painfully, to find it again. When he was finished, he unpinned the silver star from his chest and handed it to Judge Fairfield. The judge, in a move that startled everyone, did not appoint one of the established men. He pinned the star on the crisp blouse of Nora Bell, the quiet, no-nonsense woman who had served as the town's telegraph operator. A woman in charge of the law was a new and radical idea in Silver Bluff, and it felt like a wind of change, clean and sharp, blowing down from the mountains, high above the town's shifting politics. May and Boone were engaged in the slow, satisfying work of rebuilding. They did not try to erase the scars of the fire. Instead, they embraced them. They scraped the deep char from the logs of the cabin wall, then sealed the blackened wood with pine tar and resin. The result was a beautiful, dramatic pattern, a swirling design of black and gold that told the story of what the cabin had endured. It was a house that had been through the fire and had not only survived, but had been made more beautiful by the ordeal. They worked together in a comfortable, easy rhythm, their movements synchronized, their silences as meaningful as their conversations. They also began the practical work of assessing the claim. Boone, his arm healing but still stiff, taught May how to properly shore up a small exploratory tunnel and how to follow the dark, promising line of the silver sulfide vein. They brought down basket after basket of the heavy, dark ore. The assays confirmed their initial hopes the pocket was rich, but it was not a mountain of silver. It was a modest, finite seam, enough to provide a good, comfortable living for two people willing to work hard, enough to pay back Emily for her help, and to contribute a healthy sum to the new miners' fund. It was not the kind of strike that made headlines or built mansions. It was the kind of strike that built a life, and for both of them, that was more than enough. One morning, Boone made coffee, his brow furrowed in concentration, trying to get the proportions right. He handed a cup to May. She took a sip, and the faintest hint of a smile played on her lips. It was still weak. Boone sighed in frustration. "I do not understand it. I use more grounds every time." May looked at him, her eyes full of a warm, gentle humor. "Perhaps you just need to add a little more hope to the pot," she said. He looked at her, and then he laughed, a real, unburdened laugh that echoed in the small cabin. It was the sound of a man learning to live again, learning that a shared joke over weak coffee could be a finer thing than a lonely fortune. A subtle shift was happening between them, a slow and quiet recalibration of their souls. May, who had walked through the world with her defenses always at the ready, found herself lowering them, brick by brick. She would find herself reaching out to steady his injured arm without thinking, or placing a hand on his back as they looked over the claim. She was learning to accept his quiet care, the way he always made sure she had the less strenuous task, the way he watched her with a look of profound, steady affection that needed no words. And Boone, a man who had long ago locked his heart away in a place as deep and silent as a mine shaft, was learning to speak. He would tell her stories of his childhood, of the fish in the Missouri creeks, of the father who had taught him to be patient and to listen to the earth. He spoke of the wife who had left, not with bitterness, but with a simple, sad honesty, acknowledging the pain without letting it define him. He was opening up the dark, abandoned tunnels of his own past and letting the light in. The town was changing. Emily, with May's help, officially established the Silver Bluff Miners Safety and Relief Fund, the fine levied against the Black Mesa Company, which was now under new, more scrupulous management from Denver, provided the initial capital. For the first time, the men who went into the dark had the assurance that their families would be cared for if the darkness claimed them. The community, which had once been a collection of individuals scrambling for their own gain, was beginning to feel like a community. The most telling sign of the change was a small, silent gesture. Miners, on their way up to the high country claims, would often take a detour past Boone's cabin. They would leave a full canteen of fresh water hanging from a post. A silent thank you. A recognition of a debt that could not be paid in coin. In a land where water was life, it was the highest tribute they could offer. One evening in the late fall, a crisp chill in the air hinted at the coming winter. The aspens on the mountainside had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. May and Boone sat on the small porch they had rebuilt, watching the last light fade from the sky, painting the clouds in shades of rose and violet. Boone took a small harmonica from his pocket. He tapped it against his palm, then began to play. The tune was simple, a slow, sweet melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a song of quiet valleys and lonely campfires, a song of hope and heartache. He did not play it for an audience. He played it for the twilight, for the mountains, for the woman sitting beside him. When the last note faded into the immense silence, he set the harmonica down. He stood and held out his good hand to May. She took it without a word. He drew her to her feet, and there, on the rough pine boards of the porch, they began to dance. It was not a real dance, just a slow, shuffling sway to the silent music in their hearts. He held her with his one good arm, and she rested her head on his chest. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was a dance of quiet intimacy, a testament to all they had endured and all they had found. They were two solitary people who had discovered they were no longer alone. A few days later, May was sketching in her notebook, not the notes of a prospector, but the intricate design of a machine. It was a small water wheel, connected by a series of gears and cams to a set of heavy iron-shod stamps. "What is that?" Boone asked, looking over her shoulder. "It is a way to make the mountain do the hard work," she explained. "We can divert a small part of the creek to turn the wheel. The wheel will lift and drop the stamps to crush the ore. It will save our backs and our time." Boone studied the drawing, his practical mind immediately grasping the elegant simplicity of it. He looked at her, his admiration clear in his eyes. She was not just his partner in sentiment. She was his partner in ingenuity, in building a future. That evening, as May was tidying the small shelf above the hearth, her fingers brushed against the small, rough loop of silver Boone had made, the failed ring. She picked it up, its weight familiar in her palm. It was not a symbol of failure. It was a symbol of their beginning, of a promise made in the heart of the fire. She looked at the small, faded tintype of her brother, Thomas, which stood on the shelf. He looked back at her with his serious, hopeful eyes. Gently, she leaned the small, imperfect circle of silver against the photograph, a tribute to the brother whose legacy had brought her here, and a quiet testament to the new, unexpected partnership she had found. It was a perfect, incomplete circle, a story that was not yet over. The preparations began with a quiet, deliberate ceremony. Boone rose before dawn, and instead of his usual quick, functional coffee, he engaged in a ritual. He measured the beans with a concentration usually reserved for assessing ore, ground them to a precise consistency, and watched the pot on the hearth as if it held the secret to the universe. He was on a mission to brew the single most perfect cup of coffee of his life. Later that morning, he rode Agate down to Silver Bluff, leaving May with a list of chores that he knew would keep her busy. His first stop was not the general store, but Amelie Finch's shop. Amelie saw him coming, and a knowing smile touched her lips. "I have it ready," she said, before he could even speak. She produced a package wrapped in brown paper. It was a dress of a deep, cornflower blue, the color of the mountain sky just after a summer rain. It was simple, well made, with a modest neckline and a full skirt. It was a dress for a woman who was beautiful without needing adornment. "How did you know?" Boone asked, his voice a low rumble of astonishment. Amelie's smile widened. "A woman knows these things. Mr. Lark, besides, you have had the look of a man about to leap off a very high cliff for the past week. I assumed you would want to be properly dressed for the occasion." Boone paid her, his face flushing a dark red beneath his tan. He tucked the package carefully into his saddlebag. then spent the rest of his time in town gathering not just supplies, but small luxuries, a small bag of real sugar, a tin of peaches, a new, unbroken chimney for the oil lamp. When he returned to the cabin, May was nowhere to be seen. He knew she would be up at the claim, sketching out the final details for her water wheel. The coffee he brewed sat waiting, still warm on the back of the hearth. He set about his final preparation. He took a pair of shears and carefully trimmed the wild sagebrush that grew in unruly clumps around the small porch. He was not a gardener, but he worked with a patient, focused hand, shaping the bushes, releasing their clean, sharp, peppery scent into the crisp afternoon air. He was not just tidying a yard, he was preparing a home. He found her late in the day, standing on the flat granite outcrop that overlooked Dry Needle Creek, the place they called Discovery Point. The sun was low in the sky, and the light was the color of warm honey, bathing the canyon in a gentle, forgiving glow. She was looking down at the small, winding thread of water, a look of quiet, peaceful ownership on her face. He came and stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. They watched as a lone hawk circled on the evening thermals, a perfect, effortless master of its domain. In his pocket, his fingers closed around a small, heavy object. He had spent 2 days at the town's small smithy, working with the blacksmith, using the man's forge and tools. He had taken the small, failed loop of silver, melted it down once more, and this time, with patience and care, had forged it into a proper ring. It was not a delicate, city-made thing. It was a simple, solid band of pure, high-country silver, polished to a soft, deep luster, its surface bearing the faint, unique marks of the hammer that had shaped it. It was a ring that had been through the fire. He took her hand. It felt small and strong in his own. "May," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. He turned her to face him. He looked into her eyes, the eyes that had seen so much loss but had never lost their capacity for strength and truth. He did not kneel. It was not his way. He simply stood before her, a plain man offering a plain and honest heart. He held out the ring on the palm of his calloused hand. "I cannot promise you riches," he said, his words simple, unadorned, and truer than any poem. "I can only promise you a roof that will not lie." May looked from the ring to his face. She saw the fear there, the profound vulnerability of a man offering up the last, most precious piece of himself. She saw the years of loneliness, the old wounds, and the quiet, steady strength that had carried him through it all. She saw home. Tears did not come. Instead, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile that seemed to light her from within. She did not reach for the ring. Instead, she laid her hand flat against his chest, over the steady, thumping beat of his heart. "The roof is here," she said softly. He slipped the silver band onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. In the weeks that followed, the new life they had forged for themselves, and for the town, began to take solid shape. The Miners' Fund, administered by a board that included Amelie, May, and one of the oldest, most respected shift bosses, paid for new timbers in the main shaft and purchased 3 state-of-the-art breathing apparatuses from back east, under Sheriff Nora Bell's watchful eye. The crooked card games at the Mercury Saloon were shut down, and the town's quiet, industrious citizens began to feel that the streets belonged to them again. And whenever May and Boone rode into town for supplies, the miners they passed would no longer avert their eyes. They would stop, and, in a gesture of quiet, profound respect, they would remove their hats until the couple had passed. It was a silent, daily affirmation that justice, in the wild country, was not found in fancy words, but in the steadfast courage of ordinary people. May found she no longer walked with her shoulders braced against the world. She had found her place, not on a map, but in the quiet, unconditional acceptance of the man by her side. She had learned to trust not only him, but herself, to believe in her own worth regardless of the world's harsh judgments. And Boone, who had once believed his heart was a claim that had been played out and abandoned, discovered new, unmined veins of love and laughter within himself. He had learned that opening a door that had once been slammed shut was not an act of foolishness, but the ultimate act of faith. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down from a gray sky, they sat before the hearth. Boone took one of the pieces of charred wood they had salvaged from the fire, a dark, silent witness to the night their world had almost ended. He held it for a moment, then gently placed it on the bed of glowing embers in the fireplace. They watched together as a small, hesitant flicker of orange appeared at the edge of the blackened wood. The flicker grew, catching hold, and a new flame, bright and clean, sprang to life, consuming the scar of the past and turning it into warmth and light for the future. It was the way of the fire. It was the way of the gold. It was their way. Outside, the snow fell, blanketing the mountains in a clean, white peace. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint, clean scent of sage. On the small porch of the cabin that had been through the fire, two shadows stood for a moment, looking out at the vast, wild world. They were small figures in an immense landscape, but in the quiet space they had carved out for themselves, in the home they had built in each other's hearts, they were giants. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.